Hi, welcome back. Today we are going to be continuing with the topic that we began in our last lecture. That is identity, and how do we form our identities? How do we construct our own identity and also the identity of other groups? We do this in several different ways, and so we kicked off our conversation looking first at ethnicity, and you also watched this film about the Hmong becoming American. And we will continue with that today. We'll talk more about ethnicity, but also gender, race, and nationalism, which is an extremely recent way in which many people now identify on a large scale in terms of the nation state. So just to sort of recap where we left off, uh, last time we began our discussion on identity with ethnicity. I introduced to you a group called the Hmong, which come from different regions of Asia. They're essentially subsistence hill farmers. And the film Becoming American, which was made in 1983, is about resettlement of Hmong refugees in various host countries, one of which is the US. And so the film gives you some background, as did I, on why the Hmong are refugees in the first place. So during the Vietnam War and also the Laotian Civil War, the US military got involved for our own reasons and own interests. And when we were fighting over there against the Vietnamese, the US military, the CIA specifically, went and recruited Hmong villagers to fight for them, basically as guerrilla warfare. The Hmong know the terrain, they understand the landscape, they can move around quite easily. They were good fighters for the Americans against the Vietnamese. And this whole operation was known as the US's Secret War. It was called the Secret War because the US was not transparent. They didn't actually tell the citizens what they were doing by enlisting the Hmong to fight for us. So when the US pulled out of Vietnam and left the war, the Vietnamese began systematically seeking out and exterminating the Hmong, killing them because the Hmong had fought against the Vietnamese in the war for the U.S. A few lucky thousand Hmong were airlifted out by Air America at the time, and thousands of Hmong, hundreds of thousands of the rest of them, were left to flee their homeland, to flee the Vietnamese, who were again systematically seeking them out and killing them. Um, People weren't able to stay where they traditionally had. This leads so you have sort of three options when you're now in this position of needing political asylum, needing to leave where you live because you're being persecuted either politically or socially or economically. Essentially, you're not going to survive there, and you need to leave. So you can either stay and most likely die. That did happen to some Hmong. The second option is to flee your homeland and seek out a refugee camp in neighboring countries. Many Hmong, after the Secret War, fled to Thailand and other areas where they lived in crowded refugee camps for several years, sometimes even decades. And refugee camps are not nice places to be. Resources are limited. They're often dirty. Sanitation is a problem. It's not it's not even a Motel 8, way worse. So not a desirable option. And then some people, if they're lucky, and after several years of paperwork and vetting to make sure these people are who they say they are, that they're actually facing persecution in their home country, after several years essentially of this vetting, some of the Hmong were selected to be resettled in third countries, host countries, different European countries, and also the US. And so the film sort of looks at people in the US and their reaction to the Hmong being here. Some of the stuff that gets said is hopefully disturbing to you. For example, some of the white people in the film talking about they don't need to be here and they should go back where they came from. And, we got our own people to take care of. Why should we be helping them or taking care of them? They're taking resources from us. And okay, that's one side of the argument, but as mentioned, one reason why many would argue we should host Hmong refugees, we should help them, is because the very reason that they are in that situation, that they've become refugees, is because of US actions, because our military involved them in a clandestine military affair that they didn't tell anyone about, and it resulted in them getting murdered by their geographic neighbors afterwards. So some would argue we have not just an obligation, but a moral responsibility to help out. to provide a safe haven, because we are the very reason these people are in this situation. And it's not just the Hmong. This is true for refugees from all sorts of places around the world. For example, in the last few years, there's been a big debate in the US between the right and the left of the political spectrum over immigration. Those on the right, Donald Trump and Republicans, are sort of anti-immigration, close down the southern border, keep them out, keep us in. Other people would say this country was built on immigration. I mean, what are you talking about? We'll talk more about that at the end of the lecture. But likewise, just like the Hmong were seeking refuge because they had no other option, this is true for a lot of Latin American migrants. Women, children, families, these thousands of people that were migrating up towards the US southern border to seek some sort of viable livelihood. It's not because they're coming up here trying to get fat off McDonald's and shop at Walmart. Do you want to leave everything you know, your culture, your home, your family, where you were born, to go to another culture? Neither do they. People in Latin America are facing economic, political persecution. The type of people that would travel hundreds of miles, thousands of miles through the desert with their little children and babies to maybe have a shot at crossing the border, to maybe be able to provide for themselves and their children. Those are the type of people that don't really have any other choice, right? It's either stay and die or fight for your survival and flee. And so I would encourage you to delve deeper into the history of different ethnic groups and nation states, because it's a lot more complicated than we sort of learn in our high school history classes. So one reason why the US should allow refugees to resettle here is, in many cases, we are the reason that they are refugees, either economically or politically. If you have any questions about that, or you want some more examples, feel free to jump on the discussion board. The examples are sort of endless. Okay, so that's a little bit about ethnicity, which again we'll come back to later today. How do we envision ourselves? How do we form our identities? And how do we form the identity of others? To live in groups, we need to know how to categorize things, ideas, and especially people. Who is in our group, who belongs to their group. And we depend on cultural rules for knowing who we are and who other people are. We have these principles of exclusion: who's not in the group, maybe based off skin color or ethnicity or geographic origin or language or customs, and who's in the group, who's included, who is part of us and who is part of the other. Some important concepts that we use to categorize people, us and the other. These include ethnicity, also race, nationality, and gender. And one thing that all of these categories share is that all of them are cultural constructions. There is nothing natural or innate or objective about any of these categories or identities formed through them. They are culturally constructed, they are fluid, and they change in relation to other things. And so let's talk about gender first. One very basic social construction of identity is a person's gender. Gender in any society is a key dimension of a person's social identity. It determines how you might relate to other people based off your own gender and their gender, how other people relate to you. And gender is also a basis for allocating roles, like in work, to people. So are you hunting? Are you gathering? Are you cooking? Are you doing construction? Age and kinship are also categories that we use to allocate work roles, as is gender. And so a really important thing about gender is that it is culturally constructed. It is not biological. So a person's sex, their actual DNA and genetics. Let's just take the sex chromosomes. So two X chromosomes for female and an XY for male. The sex, is biological. This is genetic, with some caveats that are beyond the purview of this class. But gender, so female and male, right? Female. That's supposed to be an F, and male. Sex, that's biological. Gender, however, whether someone identifies as a woman, this is really hard to write on, or a man, that is culturally, socially constructed. That is not objectively biological. So to explain what I mean, I usually like to do an exercise in class. And the exercise helps illustrate how our culture influences how we think about gender, more so than biology. So the question I usually like to start with is, for all the women, all the females in the class, or however you identify, if you woke up the next day as a man, how would your life change? How would your day to day be different? Same question for the guys. If you wake up as a woman the next day, what's changed for you? Maybe you dress differently. Maybe it takes you more time or less time to get ready. Maybe you might put on makeup. You might not. You might sit differently when you're out in public. All these different, what would change for you? Think about it for a few minutes. Maybe even jot down a couple of things that pop into your mind. I usually like to do this as a class because it's way more fun. But I stole this idea from another anthropologist who has a real quick 9-minute YouTube video about this exact question. So he asks his group of students the same thing. If you're a woman, you wake up the next day as a man, how would your life be different? What kind of things would change as you go through your day? Men, same question. Wake up as a woman, what's changed? So what I want you to do is go ahead, pause the lecture, type this URL into your browser, and watch the 9.5-minute video on how culture influences our conceptions of gender. So go ahead, take a look, and then rejoin the lecture, and we'll continue from there. Okay, so hopefully you watched the clip. Thanks for bearing with me. Sorry you have to go type the link in each time. YouTube won't let me embed YouTube videos in my own YouTube video. So that's just how we have to do it for now. And so the question sort of becomes, all these things that change, women that wake up as men, men that wake up as women, what's changed for them the next day? And they talk about, oh, maybe if I am now a man, I won't need as much time to get ready and kind of roll out of bed, throw some clothes on, whatever, and don't have to worry about what I look like. Of course, many of these are stereotypes, right? Females, maybe you wake up as a female, now it takes you much longer to get ready. When you're out in public, sitting down, you be conscious about where your legs are, right? You don't sit with your legs spread wide open. Or maybe if you're now a man, you can go out later at night walking alone. It's less dangerous somehow. Okay, and so you've watched the video, hopefully come up with a few of your own ideas of what might have changed for you. And the main point is how many of these changes, what's changed when you wake up the opposite sex the next day? How many of these changes, taking longer to get ready, wearing different clothes, being a cook versus a construction worker, how many of these are actually due to changes in the biology rather than changes in the societal expectations of what your role should be in that gender? So it's not the biology that creates most of the changes. The biology has changed, but so much of what we ascribe to gender we think of as biological, and it's not. It's cultural. It's social expectations that surround what that gender role should be in that society. We ascribe it as if it's biology, but it's not. It's cultural. And one piece of evidence for this is the type of role a man or a woman might take on in a different society. It depends on the society, right? There's nothing innate or inherent or biological about that. It's culturally constructed. The gender, as are the roles that are assigned to that gender role and the expectations of that society on that person of that gender. This is all cross-culturally variable. And so gender is cultural. It's not biological. Again, sex is biological. Gender identity is not. It's culturally constructed. It varies cross-culturally. A lot of other types of societies throughout space and time don't have just 2 gender identities. They have 3 and 4 gender identities, roughly translating maybe as man-woman or woman-man. Gender might be binary. It often is in different societies, so 2 sexes, 2 genders, but often it's not. It might correlate with sex, whereas the male sex correlates with being a man, being of a masculine gender, and the female sex correlates with femininity, being a woman, but not always. This depends on the society that we're talking about. And this isn't even true in our own society today. Sexual orientation, whether one is heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual, this is also fluid and malleable over time. Um, Depending on what society you're looking at and what period of time you're looking at, the amount of people of different sexual orientations, some are heterosexual, some are homosexual, more or less, this changes over time. For example, if you look at the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans, homosexuality was not only accepted, it was even celebrated among older men and younger boys. Or if you look at homosexuality or non-heterosexual identities in the US today. It's probably a lot more common than it was 100 years ago, but that's probably not because people's identities have changed, that there's suddenly more homosexuals. It's that cultural attitudes about that have changed, and so people are more comfortable in expressing their actual identity. So this is fluid over time as well. And in many societies, both past and present, they not only tolerate alternative, multiple, more than two gender identities, but they've institutionalized them. They've embedded them into the society as an accepted role, not sort of an alternative or fringe role. Your book, I would point you to Peoples and Bailey for different examples of third and fourth gender identities cross-culturally. The example I will highlight for you has to do with individuals known as two-spirits. Two-spirits are found among lots of different Native American societies in North America, over 150 different cultures it's been found in. And two-spirit means, it's derived from the Siouan phrase that means a person who has both female and male spirits. The older term to refer to two spirits was berdache. This is condescending, and we don't use this term anymore. So two spirits. And these two spirits, often also sort of roughly translated as man, woman, or woman, man, represent third and fourth gender categories. They often adopted the work roles of the other sex, the attire of the other sex, and even the societal role. So for example, on the slide, this is a photo of a Zuni two-spirit, Wewa, and you can see on the picture, Wewa is dressed as a female here, but in other photos at other times, Wewa dresses as a male. He also altered not only his attire, but also his work role. And so you can have women that take on hunting instead of typical housework, or likewise men, instead of going out hunting, might stay in the household of birth and help and take on a more typically feminine role. And two spirits are often held in high esteem. They're not stigmatized. They're sometimes even celebrated. For example, families that had a two spirit residing with them actually could be seen as even more successful, because this person, the two spirit, doesn't leave the household of birth, and so the household is getting resources, they're contributing to that household for their entire life. And because sometimes the two spirits, if they're sort of men women, genetically male but taking on a gender role that is again a two spirit gender role, then these people can actually produce, sort of contribute to the household twice as much as, say, a woman, because they're not burdened with pregnancy and childbirth and lactation and breastfeed. So these people were favored. They were held in high esteem in their household and in their society. Some were even thought to have spiritual powers. And so intersex categories and other things considered odd or strange by Americans are not only tolerated, but even celebrated in other cultures. Again, these people can adopt the behaviors and roles that are typical of the other sex in things like clothing and work, and even sexual preference, with really no stigmatization. It's an institutionalized, accepted third and fourth gender identity. And so the existence throughout time and space of multiple gender roles and sexual orientations demonstrates that intolerance towards them is not universal and is also therefore not inevitable. That's a little bit about gender. Let's talk a little bit about ethnicity and race. Anthropologists most often define race and ethnicity as socially constructed groupings, just like gender. It seems so obvious to people that race and ethnicity are biological, objective. Look at the picture, right? You can see it, black, Asian, white. It seems so obviously based in biology, but if we look past skin deep differences, it is not based in biology. Race and ethnicity are groupings, are categories that can only really be formed through contrast. They are defined in terms of difference. They are relational. So what is black in relation to other black-looking populations? You wouldn't define it. It's only when black populations are next to white or brown or other colored populations that the differences become highlighted, right? They are relational categories formed in terms of difference, who else you're around, where you are. And so these categories aren't innate or inevitable. They're not objective. They're assigned to people. They're social ascriptions. And the labels, whether one is of a particular race or ethnicity, this can change depending on where that person is, what culture is defining it, and what other groups of people the person is around. They are relational categories, nothing innate or absolute about them. So ethnicity versus race. Ethnicity is generally based off a handful of shared characteristics. These include having a shared territory. So an ethnic group typically has a homeland, land that they consider themselves to have autonomy over. It belongs to them. The Kurds, the Scots, the Palestinians, the Israelis are all examples of this. In fact, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that's been going on now for almost 100 years, in which a lot of people have died, goes back directly to this argument over whose homeland is it, Palestinians or Israelis. And then when Israel was formed in the early 1900s with the help of Britain and other colonial powers, it was formed right smack in the middle of Palestinian land. So whose territory, it depends on how far you want to go back. Anyways, territory is an important part of ethnicity. Also, people of the same ethnic group are defined by a shared history, culture, and values. So history, coming from sort of the same place, having the same origin myths, like Americans all share the origin myth of Thanksgiving, even though that's exactly what it is, a myth, not actual history. They have shared cultures, meaning maybe similar styles of dress or food, also shared values. They could share the same religion or perhaps moral or ethical values. And also ethnic groups tend to share the same language, all the way down to sharing the same dialect and or accent within that language. So shared territory, shared history, culture, values, and language. It's these shared things that define ethnicity. In contrast, race is not defined by these shared characteristics. Race is typically defined only by ascribed status of skin color and maybe a handful of other traits like hair form or eye form. So it's really people looking at skin color and then subjectively assigning a label to that of what group they belong to based off their skin color. We've talked a bit about why race is not a biological concept, and we'll look at that a little further right now. Take a look at the picture of hearts. There's a heart from a white population, a black population, and an Asian population. When we go below skin differences, our differences really are only skin deep, you can't tell what race these hearts come from, right? And one reason for that is because there is no suite of biological traits by which to define human races. It's not a biological concept. It's a social concept that's been ascribed to biology falsely. Race is one of the primary folk biological rationalizations for enforcing social inequality. So folk, meaning it's a layperson's explanation, not an expert or a scientist. Race is one of the primary folk explanations for social inequality. Oh, these people are not doing as well. They have poorer health because they don't have as good of jobs, because they're not as smart, because they're of an inferior race, right? I'm not saying that, but this is what people have said. So it therefore justifies social inequality as a natural outcome of the system, right? Superior races are going to do better, and they should. Again, this is a really incorrect way to understand human variation. And so races are typically based on appearance, namely skin color. Again, maybe eye form, face shape, hair form, but not much else. Recall the evolutionary explanation for skin color gradients across the globe. And Jared Diamond gives a very different explanation. You read from Jared Diamond, Race Without Color for today. I want you to ignore the explanation that Jared Diamond gives. He explains skin color in relation to sexual selection, and I'll just leave it at he doesn't provide solid evidence for this, and it's not a parsimonious explanation. So I want you to remember what I told you about the evolutionary explanation for skin color, regardless of Diamond's argument. Skin color varies due to natural selection to enhance human survival, as do many other traits, right? Like body size, the evolution of the sickle cell, lactose production, right? The evolution of continuing to produce lactase enzymes so we can digest milk. A lot of variation as a result of natural selection to enhance survival. A lot of variation is also just simply a result of genetic drift and random mutations. It may serve no purpose at all. And so skin color has a survival advantage. Again, ignore what Diamond said. We see darker skin color in equatorial regions where sunlight, UV radiation is more intense. The high level of melanin, that dark color in the skin that creates the dark pigmentation, high levels of melanin are adaptive in UV intense areas. UV radiation intensity can damage your DNA, it can cause cancer and all sorts of other problems. So high melanin, dark skin was selected for in equatorial regions to protect against the harmful effects of UV radiation. As you move north or southward in latitude, UV radiation becomes less intense. However, having high levels of melanin, dark skin at these north and south latitudes becomes counterproductive. You don't need it to protect from harmful UV radiation because it's not as intense. However, having too much melanin, too dark of skin in these lighter, less sun-intense regions can become counterproductive. It interferes with your body's ability to synthesize vitamin D, which is an important nutrient for bone growth. Vitamin D is synthesized in the epidermis. It requires UVB radiation from the sun for your body to do it. And so you're seeing a trade-off. High melanin to protect from UV radiation, and as you move north or south, skin color becomes lighter. You don't need it because UV is not as intense, but having too dark of skin will not allow you to absorb enough sunlight to produce enough vitamin D, which can cause rickets and all sorts of other problems in development and growth. So it's adaptive to have different levels of melanin depending on UV radiation so that you're not getting harmful UV effects and you're also still synthesizing enough vitamin D to grow and develop properly. Okay. Race, therefore, is not a biologically valid concept. Skin color is an evolutionary trait. Race is an idea that people ascribed to skin color. More evidence for this. So you should have read Race Without Color by Jared Diamond, a real short classic article that examines this exact concept, that race is not a biological concept. And so he sort of opens up his argument looking at other species where the concept of race does actually work. He talks about bird populations in North America, specifically the yellow-rumped warblers. And what he says is among warblers, there actually are different races of the same species. So you know all of the birds are of the same species if they can mate and reproduce successfully with one another. That's the defining criteria for a species. They can interbreed. The individuals in the population can successfully interbreed. Warblers, there's two types Diamond talks about. There's sort of the white-throated warbler that lives in the eastern U.S. and the yellow-throated warbler that lives in the western U.S. And unlike humans, among the warbler species, you actually can define different races because they demonstrate genetic concordance. So the white-throated warblers don't just have white throats in contrast to yellow. They also have specific voice, bird songs, and they also have a specific habitat preference. And that's in the white yellow-throated warblers. In the yellow-throated warblers, they have an entirely different color throat, yellow. They also have a different voice, birdsong, and they live in different types of habitats. And what you're seeing is for each race in the warbler population, either the white-throated race or the yellow-throated race, there is genetic concordance. Voice, habitat preference, and throat color all correlate within the race. They are concordant. They are in agreement. If you find one of those traits, you'll find the other two as well in that race. They're not separate species because white and yellow-throated warblers can still interbreed, but we would consider them distinct races of a specific species because they are distinguished by different genetic traits that are concordant in each race. You can't do this with human biology. Human biology, there is no concordance of genetic traits in racial groupings. If you pick one trait, like skin color, that will give you one number of groups. If you have someone else use the same trait and look at skin color, they'll come up with a totally different number. If you do it by fingerprint type, and this is what Diamond goes on to do in his article, he says, well, let's do race by other biological traits. Let's move away from skin color for a second. Let's look at fingerprints. Let's look at the persistence of the lactase enzyme that allows us to digest milk products as adults. Let's look at the persistence of the sickle cell gene, which confers resistance to malaria in malarial environments. And if you look at all these other biological traits, we find no genetic concordance. There is no suite of traits that defines black-looking people and white-looking people and other colored-looking people. It just doesn't hold up because race is not biological. You can't do it. There's no concordance. So when Jared Diamond categorized people based off 3 distinct fingerprint types, which is just as biologically valid a criteria as skin color, you just can't, it's not as obvious to us, what he found was African, Europeans, and Asians were each highly distinct groups based off fingerprint types. What do you think? True or false from the article? And just for background, human fingerprints are distinguished by 3 different sort of types. You can either have sort of arches pictured on the bottom left, loops, or whorls. And good luck figuring out which one you are. And it doesn't really code for anything. Your fingerprint type isn't related to your survival or your genetic fitness in your environment. So if we define races according to fingerprint type rather than skin color, what we find is these are not distinct groups at all. Actually, if you categorize people by fingerprint type, then the 3 races you would come up with. In the loops race, we would have Europeans grouped with Black Africans and also East Asians. They would all be one race. The whorls fingerprint race would be Mongolians and also Australian Aborigines, really dark indigenous group, the indigenous people of Australia, Aborigines. And the arches race would be Coesians, Southern Africa, and some Central Europeans. So those would be your 3 races if you did it according to fingerprint type. The point, the trait you choose to distinguish various races determines the races you come up with. If you use a different equally valid biological trait, it's going to generate different categories. Let's look at another example of classifying race based off other biological traits. Diamond also looks at race by digestion. So we group races according to whether or not they still produce the enzyme lactase, which allows them to digest and consume milk products. So all mammals, human mammals and other non-human mammals, produce lactase during infancy because we all drink milk as infants from the mother. So lactase is the enzyme that breaks down the disaccharide carbohydrate in dairy products. You need lactase to break down lactose, the main carb found in milk products. And if you don't have lactase, you can't really consume dairy products. It'll upset your stomach and cause other problems. Some populations, this is why some people are lactose intolerant. Not everyone produces lactase. This has been an adaptation, persistence of the lactase allele enzyme in adulthood, is an adaptation that we find in populations that typically subsisted off dairy products. So like European farming societies, pre-industrial, that subsisted off herd animals, and also different pastoral groups in Africa like the Maasai and the Nuer that also subsist off herd animals. In these populations, there's been a retention of the lactase enzyme, which allows them to digest milk. It allows them to use this resource that people otherwise could not, to live off their herd animals. And so if we use lactase production as our divisive criterion for races, we can place Northern and Central Europeans with Arabians and such West African peoples as the Fulani. And in the lactase negative race, we can group most other African blacks with East Asians, American Indians, Southern Europeans, and Australian Aborigines. The trait you pick is going to change the number of races. Races determined by skin color don't match those determined by fingerprints, don't match those determined by body chemistry or genetics or anything else. And that's because race is culturally constructed. It just does not exist as biology. Richard Lewontin, a very famous geneticist, said 85% of all human variation between any two individuals in the human species, occurs within any given racial population, not between them. So what he's saying is if you have a big group of white-looking people grouped by skin color, you might find similarity in skin color, but it's only skin deep. If you start looking at other genetic and biological markers among white people, the population becomes really, really diverse. They're no longer similar, no longer a distinct biological group. Cavalli Sforza did a famous genetic study that shows actually there's continuous genetic variation over the entire world with no real sharp boundaries between groups and no greater similarity genetically occurring between Western and Eastern Europeans than between Europeans and Africans. So from a genetic standpoint, Europeans and Africans aren't any different from one another than Western and Eastern Europeans are from one another. Another reason race is a cultural construction, the culture you're in, the country you're in, will determine what the racial categories are. The categories, races change depending on the country or culture you travel to. So if you're in the US versus among the Kung versus in France versus in Venezuela or Brazil, the different race categories themselves are not the same. For example, on the slide, these are Brazilian names for different racial categories. There's so many different subdivisions, we don't even have words to translate all the distinctions they recognize for different races. The words are in, I believe, Portuguese, preto meaning sort of black. And so you can see the different translations. Again, some of them we can't even translate because we don't distinguish color down to that level. We don't split it up that much here in the US. And just by going to a different place, a person's race can change. Maybe some of you have experienced this. I know I have students that maybe were born in Mexico or born in the Philippines, and when they go back home, you know, they're called gringa or gringo or considered whiteys or Americans. But when they're in the actual US, they might be considered more, you know, Latina or Filipino, because again, it's determined in relation to who else you're around and where you are. There's nothing objective about it. For example, the girls on the slide, they would be considered white in Haiti, because compared to everyone else in Haiti, they're much lighter. They'd be considered black in Miami because compared to everyone else they are, and Indio Canela, which sort of means brownish, in the Dominican Republic. And again, many of you might have even experienced this, either how you identify yourself to others or how others tend to identify you, depending on where you are and who else you're around. Using phenotype, physical features, what the person looks like, to categorize people into races is completely arbitrary. It's based off individual preference and decisions. It can be done in more than one way. It's arbitrary. There's nothing inherent or natural or innate about it. And it's not that actual objective skin color that matters. It's how the color is socially recognized in the society. The social recognition of the color as a marker of difference is what generates the categories. Okay, so what do I mean? It's not really the color that matters. It's the social recognition of it that matters. I may have mentioned this study earlier in the class. There's a researcher, Jablonski, did research in, I believe, South America. Apologies, I haven't read the study recently. But what they looked at, what the researcher looked at, is they had people identify their actual skin color. Okay, so just pretend we have some objective way to do that based off, light wavelengths and sort of numerical categories. You fit here or there, just based off the actual objective wavelength, the color of your skin. So that was done. And then they also asked people to self-identify their skin color. And so the kicker was, and they were looking to see if race with air quotes, influences health disparities among racial groups. And so what they found is the actual skin color differences, there was no correlation between those of darker colors, sort of the subordinate groups, and health problems measured through proxies like high blood pressure or type 2 diabetes. So no correlation between health problems and actual skin color. But what there was a correlation between was what people identified their skin color as and health disparities. So for example, if someone was actually darker than they thought, but they self-identified as lighter, no real health disparities. But if the person was lighter but actually self-identified, saw themselves as darker in the society, these people were correlated with massive health disparities and in general poorer health. So the racial inequality that stems from it, again, it really has nothing to do with the actual absolute color of the skin or the biology. It's the way in which the society recognize people and what group they sort of belong to based off that. Just another example of how deep this goes, how much it really matters to people. Some of you may or may not be able to relate to this, depending on who you are, where you grew up. I had students in my class last semester, sisters that I don't remember if they were born in India or born here, but their parents were from India. And her mom, she shared this story with the class. Her mom was using this skin cream to lighten her skin because that's more desirable or a status symbol or whatever. Fucking culture, right? And what made the skin lighter was there's acid in it. So literally people are putting these skin lightening creams on and it's making their skin lighter because it's eating away at their skin with either carcinogens or acids. That's how deep the importance of the social recognition really goes. Another example, again, it's not the color that matters, it's how we recognize it. What ethnic origin or race category would you pick for Barack Obama? So the choices are black. Do you think he's black? Is he Asian? Is he other non-white? I don't really know what that means. Hispanic, Caucasian, Pacific Islander, American Indian, Filipino, or not sure. And so usually I like to pull the class and we get answers sort of across the board, but a lot of black, sometimes some Asian, definitely some Caucasian. And so Barack Obama is actually of East African descent and white American descent to equal parts. So half East African, half white American. And according to his mother's memoir, he probably has some Cherokee in addition to some white ancestry, Cherokee Native American Indian group. So he's not black or white, he's both, and he's a little bit of Native American too. But yet people tend to lump him into one or the other depending on how they see it. Barack Obama himself self-identifies as African American. A majority of Asian and African Americans consider Obama black. A majority of white and Latin Americans of any race classify him as biracial. It's the social recognition versus the color that matters. And in the US, we tend to follow a very stringent social rule for defining race and ethnicity. This is known as the one-drop rule, also called hypodescent. And the rule is if you have just one drop of blood of the other race or the subordinate group, then you belong to that group, that lower group, not the superior one. Again, that's not how we would talk about these different groups in terms of superior and inferiority. But meaning if an individual had any black ancestry whatsoever, they were classified as black. I mean, this is changing, but think about not too long ago, ideas against interracial marriage and this idea of polluting the gene pool that we saw in that Race, the Power of an Illusion film. So how is ethnicity different from race? So race, again, is not really based off anything other than subjective labeling of skin color groups, and then all the social inequality that follows from that. How is race different from ethnicity? So what do we mean when we say ethnicity? In everyday usage, most people think of an ethnic group as some sort of minority group within a country, or maybe some sort of exotic national geographic type culture that we see on the internet or cable TV. Look at the ethnic Barbies on the bottom of the slide, right? You could tell immediately these individuals, these Barbies, are from different cultures, different ethnicities, right? They have different identities. In anthropology, the meaning of ethnicity is broader. It's any group that explicitly regards themselves and are regarded by others as culturally distinctive. Being a member of a particular ethnic group is based off subjective belief that the people see themselves as part of that group, in which they share community and other cultural traits. And another really important thing about ethnic identity is it's situational and fluid, meaning that it can and is defined differently depending on the context. And so your book sort of gives an example. If there's a bunch of people in the U.S., a bunch of Euro-Americans from Germany, from France, from Italia, from all these different places in Europe, then you might identify yourself as not a Euro-American to everyone, because everyone's Euro-American, but you might specifically identify yourself as Italian-American, right? You can sort of expand and contract the levels at which you identify yourself in relation to other things. So you might identify as an Italian American, but say you're already among a group of Italian Americans in California and you're all talking, then instead of saying I'm Italian American, everyone knows that everyone's Italian American, you might say, but I'm a Sicilian Italian American, right? So not only you're Italian American, but you come specifically from Sicily. As opposed to some other area of Italy. So we can expand and contract our identity, and we do, depending on the situation that we're in. Give you another quick example, one of my own. So when I was working in Solomon Islands, and people are Melanesian, Micronesian, they're not white. There's very few white people over there. And people would say, you know, where are you from? And so over there, I'd say, Lo America, right? I'm from America. And that's just, instead of the US, they say America. But if I'm already in the US, right, I tell Carita and the Titiana villagers, Lo America, but if I'm already in the US, I don't say that, right? I don't say I'm from the US. I'm here. People already know that. So if I'm talking to other people from around the whole country, I might mention, well, I live in California in the US. And if I'm already in California talking to a bunch of people in California, maybe I mention I live in San Diego. And if everyone already lives in San Diego, maybe I mention I'm a North Parker, right? And if I'm already with a bunch of people that transplanted into North Park, maybe I mentioned originally I'm from Reno, Nevada, right? And so you can sort of expand, contract, and redefine the level at which you identify depending on who else is around. It's relational, right? It's defined in terms of difference and other people and the context, the overall situation. So cultural anthropologists consider race, like ethnicity, to be a cultural construction and not a biological reality. The main difference, again, is race can differ from ethnicity because it typically focuses on visible physical traits rather than shared history, language, culture, clothing, and food, some of the things that ethnicity tends to focus on. But both are constructed identities. The categories are not inevitable. They are relational. They are based on perceived degrees of similarity and difference. And everyone perceives differently depending on who you are, where you come from, what culture you were brought up in. Remember way back when we discussed language within the first few weeks of the class, and we talked about different color categories. All cultures identify colors, black, white, maybe red or green, but the way in which the societies divide the color spectrum is not the same. So that one society might recognize blue and green, whereas another culture has just one word for both blue and green. They don't recognize sort of the difference. And so it's all constructed, and we do it differently. In a lot of cases, these categories, these racial or ethnic categories, help to preserve superior status and privilege for one group over another. And they keep other groups in inferior political and economic statuses. I mean, this is true in the US still today in terms of black-white relations. I just saw a news story before I started this lecture that I don't remember if it was in Louisiana. You can look this up on your own so easily right now. I found so many articles on this. The people that are being hurt most by COVID are minorities, and specifically African Americans in certain areas. So the example on the news story I just saw, again, I don't remember what state or county they referenced, somewhere in the southeast of the US. Like 14% of the population is African American, but 70% of COVID cases are Black people, and 40% of the deaths are Black people, even though only 14% of the population is Black. The social marginalization, the inequality, the lack of access to crucial resources that is created through racial categories and the inequality it generates, this hurts people, this affects people, and it's still with us today, right? The average white household makes on average 10 times more than the average African American household. The average maternal fatality rate during pregnancy is 4 or 5 times higher for African American women than for white women. And so in many cases, these categories, these racial and ethnic labels, serve to keep one group in superior status and keep others in inferior political and economic statuses. And also assertions of ethnic solidarity, like we're all Americans, they also mask differences within a group. For example, we're all Americans, yeah, but do we all experience life the same? Are we impoverished? Are we wealthy? Do we have access to the resources we need? Is the society just, or is there lots of inequality? And like in the US, for example, we are marked by extremely unequal social relations, where some people own yachts and private islands and other people don't even know if their children or them are going to eat at night. And so this assertion of, oh, we're all Americans and you're either with us or against us, this also masks injustices, polarization of wealth and inequality within the group. And nationalism is an absolutely perfect example of this. We hear this a lot today with Donald Trump and MAGA, Make America Great Again, right? America first, America before all else. And nationalism is a really, really dangerous ideology for a lot of reasons. And we'll talk more about that here in just a minute. But this idea that, oh, we're all of this ethnicity, or we're all American, what does this gloss over, right? Do you get paid fairly for the work you do? Do you have healthy food to eat and a nice place to live? Do you have access to healthcare? Do you own hotels, yachts, private islands? What does it gloss over when we assert this overall national identity? And one more thing, nationalism is a convenient way to keep the nation state united. Oh, we're all Americans, and if you don't agree with me, you're not an American, you're not a patriot. This is what Trump says all the time. And it's really, really dangerous because it promotes the interests of those that are supposedly in the nation over the interests of all else. Let me keep going and see if I can sort of tease this apart for you a little bit more. Okay, so how do people experience identity? On the small scale, remember we were talking last week about kinship and small scale societies like the Yanomamo. On the small scale, people experience identity in terms of the family they belong to, the lineage or the clan. Are they in the patriline? Are they in the matriline? Are they in the village? Remember the category of father or mother among Yanomamo, right? How do you know what group you belong to? It based off descent, right? That tells you your identity, what group you're with. On the large scale, we don't really experience identity in this way. We experience it differently, and one of the main forms through which we do is nationalism. And under nationalism, communities become somewhat anonymous. You don't really know any to most of the people in your community, in your nation, and you never will. Yet somehow we all are said to share some sense of equality and brotherhood, right? We're all equal, all under one, and we all share the homeland. Are we all equal? Is that really true? So nationalism, to define it for you, it's an ethnic group that has a feeling of a homeland, a geographic region over which they collectively have exclusive rights. So there's a homeland and also sentiment, right? We have rights over this territory and we all have a shared identity and sovereignty over it. What's problematic about nationalism and national borders? Like, for example, do the Kung think of themselves as a nation? Are they represented by the nation that they live in? Angola and also Botswana and also Namibia, right? How are the Kung represented? So, and what about beyond sort of indigenous groups? Does anyone know how modern national borders were formed? It goes back to something called the Berlin Conference in 1885, I believe, so before the turn of the 20th century. And essentially what happened is white colonial powers, European powers, and also the US, sat down, and this is how the modern borders of Africa were formed. At the Berlin Conference, the European powers sat down and carved up the map of Africa and said, I'll take this piece, the Dutch can have that piece, France, you can have this piece. And for their own uses, right? Basically raw materials and resources that they wanted to mine out and exploit out of the country. So I'll take this piece, you take that piece. And that is literally how the modern borders of nation states in Africa and also parts of the Middle East have been formed, right? This includes India, Iraq, Rwanda. And so what you have is nation states are not groups of people that share an identity. You have multiple, often conflicting different identities, ethnic groups, livelihoods, religious values, whatever it may be, being crammed into one national border and then told to all get along. And so you want to know why there's so much civil war and ethnic conflict all over the world? This is one of the reasons, because of the way colonial powers drew our modern national borders, in which they grouped multiple, often conflicting ethnic identities into one nation state and then said, get along. This is why there's civil war in Iraq. The Sunni and the Shia of different sects of Islam traditionally never got along. They traditionally also weren't united under one community until the nation state borders of Iraq were drawn, shoving them into the same territory. No wonder there's been civil war there for the last several decades. Same thing in Rwanda, if anyone ever heard of the genocide that occurred in Rwanda, also a result of the borders drawn by colonial countries. Rwanda, which I believe was under the control of the Dutch until their independence. And there's two ethnic groups in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis, and they also physically look a little different. Tutsis are a little bit lighter skinned, but both dark. And the Dutch put the Tutsis in charge. The Tutsis essentially sort of abused that power, didn't take very good care of the Hutus. Well, when the Dutch pulled out, the Hutus outnumbered the Tutsis, and who was in power flipped. The Hutus became in power and began systematically killing the Tutsis that had sort of exploited them during their reign. Over 800,000 people murdered in less than 2 months. One of the biggest, if not biggest, genocides to ever occur. And it all, a result of different ethnic groups being crammed together in the same national borders and told to get along when they never historically got along. So Benedict Anderson talks about this notion of imagined communities. And this is sort of the last few things I want to say for today are about nationalism and this idea of imagined communities, i.e. nation states. And so what Benedict Anderson says is nation states are really recent inventions. They've only been around 250 years, less than like 0.1% of human existence. And nation states are a combination of two things: territory, the homeland, and also sentiment. The nation, right? The united citizenry. So there's the territory, we have sovereignty over a specific territory, and then national sentiment, that shared national identity that unites members of the state. And the nation needs its united citizenry to back them up, right? So they have a vested interest in making us all supportive of the nation, if you will. But this is what nationalism is. Webster's dictionary defines it: nationalism, a sense of national consciousness exalting one nation above all others and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and its interests as opposed to those of other nations. And so one of the inherent characteristics of nationalism is sort of an assumption that your nation is superior and therefore you deserve to be better off. It's okay to promote your own interests over those of other human groups. It's a really dangerous ideology. Some of the results of nationalist ideologies would be the Nazi movement. And there's also several nationalist movements going on here. Well, so in the world right now. So as of 2010, just a brief side note, as of 2010, different nationalist movements that have popped up around the world. There's currently one going on in China, and the result of the nationalist movement in China is they're basically putting Muslims in internment concentration camps because Muslims are not part of the Chinese nation state, according to what they're doing. There's also a nationalist movement going on in India. The result of that is people that are not able to prove their Indian citizenship have to move. And this is basically a way for them to make Muslims move, to kick them out of the country. There's a nationalist movement going on in Venezuela. And then there's also several nationalist movements right now going on in Western developed countries, including France, Spain, Britain, and the US. Brexit is an example of a national movement. Currently in the US, we're under a nationalist movement under Donald Trump and MAGA, Make America Great Again, to the detriment of all else. One of the results of nationalism here in the US is we put little children in cages on the southern border, in prison. No joke. That's just what it is. That's what we're doing. And we've separated families, little 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 1-year-olds that'll never see their parents again. They'll never even know how to find them again. Imagine how those people are going to grow up. So that's one of the results of nationalist movements. And one other thing I'd like to point out is in all cases with these European national movements and also in the US, there's these characteristics they share in common. And I'll give you 4 of them. The first characteristic that all these nationalist movements in the US, France, Spain, and Britain share in common is they have a somewhat ambivalent relationship with the Nazi past, meaning that they're not really critical of it. Donald Trump has a copy of Mein Kampf, of Hitler's book on his nightstand. He told, that's from his own mouth. That's what he told us. Brilliant man, he says. So sort of ambivalent about the Nazis. They weren't so bad. Another characteristic all these nationalist countries right now share is the leadership likes to focus on a perceived threat of Islam. Oh, Islam is a threat to our survival. Donald Trump does this all the time. The Muslim ban, which he passed a couple years ago, it's called the travel ban, but he referred to it as a Muslim ban because it banned people from 6 different Muslim countries from coming to the US. It was said to be done to prevent terrorism, but in all 6 countries, there were no known terrorists that came from those countries to the US. 15 of the 19 terrorists involved in the 9/11 attacks came from Saudi Arabia, which is one of our closest allies. So focus on a perceived threat from Islam. That's another thing these nationalist movements share. Even if the threat's not real, they want their citizens to perceive the threat. To unite us versus them. The third characteristic all these Western nationalist movements share right now is they have a lot of propaganda on perceived threats from ethnic minorities. For example, Donald Trump talks about the caravans of criminals and rapists coming up from the South. And really who those people were women and children and economic migrants that really had no other choice if they wanted to survive. So they spew a bunch of propaganda about the other and how they're coming to steal our land and our resources and our jobs. And fourth, they all endorse a fundamentalist Christian view. So that's a little bit about what's driving some of the current nationalist movements right now. And it's sort of this idea of exalting our own nation above everyone else because we're superior. And from the perspective of anthropology, that's simply not true. In fact, much of America was built on the backs of other people, other people's resources and other people's environments, right? We didn't build the country in a vacuum solely by our own doing. And so Benedict Anderson says a nation state is quite different from an actual real community because it's connected by an imagined affinity, not an actual affinity. So community in the traditional sense implies connection or affinity in one way or another to the other members of the community. You all know each other. You often rely on one another, interact with one another in work, worship, play. He says nations are imagined because it's a constructed identity that ties us together. It's not actually a community in the traditional sense. How many of you feel a connection to just the American identity, right? Many of us have multiple aspects to our identity, and we can be proud to be part of this country, but we can also allow everyone else to take pride in who they are too. And so a couple of quotes from Anderson. He says, an imagined community is different from an actual community because it is not and cannot be based on quotidian face-to-face interaction between its members. Instead, members hold in their minds a mental image of their affinity. We're all Americans. As Anderson says, a nation is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Finally, a nation is not only imagined, it is imagined as a community because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people not so much to kill as to willingly die for such limited imaginings. The point is, nation states, they're not really a community, they're imagined. And people will die for their nation, even though it doesn't really promote or embody their identity or their interests. Often, some of those that benefit the least from the national interest are some of its most ardent defenders. And one last important dimension of ethnicity, race, nationalism, and identity in general is all cultures at some level are simply mixtures and assemblages of other cultures. There's no such thing as a purebred culture. We are all societal mutts, if you will. I don't know if anyone's heard of Joe the Plumber. This was a famous talking point by Sarah Palin in the McCain-Obama 2008 election. And Sarah Palin sort of harkened back to this idea of I'm for the common man and the blue collar worker, Joe the plumber, right? And that was sort of her talking piece to say, you know, I represent you, I represent Joe the plumber. And so Joe the plumber is supposed to sort of represent, you know, the original American, right? Hardworking, white. Is this the original American? Does this represent you? It doesn't represent me. So maybe for some people, what the fuck is 100% American? So what I want to end this talk with is a piece written by Ralph Linton called The 100% American. And it's sort of our sarcastic account of the notion of being 100% American, and also this notion that people are somehow not American or don't belong here, right? And are stealing our land and our stuff. So the 100% American, I'm going to read it to you. It's just about a page by Ralph Linton. Diffusion of ideas, a pattern of behavior, or an exchange of material objects is always a two-way street between societies. Americans often think it is a one-way process. Others adopt our customs and superior technology, but such is not the case. Americans have received as much as they have given to other peoples. Our rapid assimilation of new items and our pride in self-sufficiency may prevent us from seeing what has actually happened. Okay, there can be no question about the average American's Americanism or his desire to preserve this precious heritage at all costs. Nevertheless, some insidious foreign ideas have already wormed their way into his civilization without his realizing what was going on. Thus, Don finds the unsuspecting patriot garbed in pajamas, a garment of East Indian origin, and lying in a bed built on a pattern which originated in either Persia or Asia Minor. He's muffled to the ears in un-American materials: cotton, first domesticated in India; linen, domesticated in the Near East; wool from an animal native to Asia Minor; or silk, whose uses were first discovered by the Chinese. All these substances have been transformed into cloth by methods invented in southwestern Asia. If the weather is cold enough, he may even be sleeping under an air-down quilt invented in Scandinavia. On awakening, he glances at the clock, a medieval European invention, uses one potent Latin word in abbreviated form, rises in haste, and goes to the bathroom. Here, if he stops to think about it, he must feel himself in the presence of a great American institution. He will have heard stories of both the quality and frequency of foreign plumbing, and will know that in no other country does the average man perform his ablutions in the midst of such splendor. But the insidious foreign influence pursues him even here. Glass was invented by the ancient Egyptians, the use of glazed tiles for floors and walls was the Near East, porcelain in China, and the art of enameling on metal by Mediterranean artisans of the Bronze Age. Even his bathtub and toilet are but slightly modified copies of Roman originals. The only purely American contribution to the ensemble in the bathroom is the steam radiator, against which our patriot very briefly and unintentionally places his posterior, his butt. It's a heater. It burned him. In this bathroom, the American washes with soap invented by the ancient Gauls. Next, he cleans his teeth, a subversive European practice which did not invade America until the latter part of the 18th century. He then shaves, a masochistic rite first developed by the heathen priests of ancient Egypt and Sumer. The process is made less of a penance by the fact that his razor is of steel and iron carbon alloy discovered in either India or Turkestan. Lastly, he dries himself on a Turkish towel. Returning to the bedroom, the unconscious victim of un-American practices removes his clothes from a chair invented in the Near East and proceeds to dress. He puts on close-fitting tailored garments whose form derives from the skin clothing of the ancient nomads of the Asiatic steppes and fastens them with buttons whose prototypes appeared in Europe at the close of the Stone Age. This costume is appropriate enough for outdoor exercise in a cold climate, but is quite unsuited to American summers, steam-heated houses, and Pullmans. Nevertheless, foreign ideas and habits hold the unfortunate man in thrall, even when common sense tells him that the authentically American costume of gee-string and moccasins would be far more comfortable. He puts his feet in stiff coverings made from hide prepared by a process invented in ancient Egypt and cut into a pattern which can be traced back to ancient Greece, and makes sure that they are properly polished, also a Greek idea. Lastly, he ties about his neck a strip of brightly colored cloth, which is a vestigial survival of the shoulder shawls worn by 17th century Croats. He gives himself a final appraisal in the mirror, an old Mediterranean invention that goes downstairs to eat breakfast. Here, a whole new series of foreign things confronts him. His food and drink, I'm almost done. His food and drink are placed before him in pottery vessels, the popular name of which, China, is sufficient evidence for their origin. His fork is a medieval Italian invention, and his spoon a copy of a Roman original. He will usually begin the meal with coffee, an Abyssinian plant first discovered by the Arabs. The American is quite likely to need it to dispel the morning after effects of overindulgence in fermented drinks invented in the Near East or distilled ones invented by the alchemists of medieval Europe. Whereas the Arabs took their coffee straight, he will probably sweeten it with sugar, discovered in India, and dilute it with cream. Both the domestication of cattle and the technique of milking have originated in Asia Minor. If our patriot is old-fashioned enough to adhere to the so-called American breakfast, his coffee will be accompanied by an orange, domesticated in the Mediterranean region, a cantaloupe, domesticated in Persia, or grapes, domesticated in Asia Minor. He will follow this with a bowl of cereal made from grain, domesticated in the Near East and prepared by methods also invented there. From this, he will go on to waffles, a Scandinavian invention with plenty of butter, originally a Near Eastern cosmetic. As a side dish, he may have the egg of a bird domesticated in Southeastern Asia, or strips of flesh of an animal domesticated in the same region, which have been salted and smoked by a process invented in Northern Europe. Breakfast over, he places upon his head a molded piece of felt invented by the nomads of Eastern Asia, and if it looks like rain, puts on outer shoes of rubber discovered by the ancient Mexicans, and takes an umbrella invented in India. He then sprints for his train. The train, not sprinting, began an English invention. At the station, he pauses for a minute to buy a newspaper, paying for it with coins invented in ancient Lydia. Once on board, he settles back to inhale the fumes of a cigarette invented in Mexico or a cigar invented in Brazil. Meanwhile, he reads the news of the day and printed on characters invented by ancient Semites by a process invented in Germany upon a material invented in China. As he scans the latest editorial pointing out the dire results to our institutions of accepting foreign ideas, he will not fail to thank a Hebrew God in an Indo-European language that he is 100%, the decimal system invented by Greeks, American, the word American coming from Americus Vespucci, which was an Italian geographer. So you can take pride in being an American, but allow others to take pride in who you are. And remember that in the end, we're all mixtures and assemblages and a culmination of cultural diffusion and borrowing. There is no such thing as the pure or 100% American. And be very cautious of people pushing that point or things about nationalism. It's typically a very dangerous rhetoric. Okay, so that will wrap up our discussion on identity. If you have questions, please get in touch either on the discussion board, shoot me an email, and I also have office hours via Zoom. All right, have a good rest of your day.